Good morning, everybody. I'm Linda Conway. I'm the Executive Director for NEMPA, and welcome to the final day of virtual sessions for the New England Newspaper Convention. The session that we're about to do is very important. It's about philanthropic funding for local journalism, and I'm really excited about this. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers. If you have any questions, we're going to have a question and answer period at the end, but if you have questions as we go along, please put them in the chat and we'll be sure to address them. I'm going to introduce Melanie Plenda. Melanie has been unbelievably helpful in setting up this whole summit. She's fantastic. She is the director of the Granite State News Collaborative. And I'll hand it over to you, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Linda, and right back at you. So hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to the News Philanthropy panel. I'm Melanie Plenda, the director of the Granite State News Collaborative in New Hampshire. We have a packed session for you today. As many of you may be aware, there's a growing trend of local news outlets looking to philanthropic support, whether from local foundations, donors, businesses, or higher education, in order to keep providing communities the information they need. And while many may see journalism as a noble cause, even critical to democracy, it's not always clear how supporting journalism with donations or philanthropic investment can help an organization or a foundation meet its mission, or an individual or a family meet their charitable goals. So we're all here today to hopefully start to answer some of those questions for you. So as Linda said, please do feel free to leave your questions and comments in the chat. We've left the last 20 minutes or so of our session for audience Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to Nina Sachdev, Director of Communications for Media Impact Funders, which is a national membership organization that advances the work of a broad range of funders committed to effective use and support of media in the public interest.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you to you and Linda for inviting me to come and speak to you all today. As Melanie mentioned, I work for an organization called Media Impact Funders, and it's an organization of funders who support media and journalism in the public interest. And I'll unpack what exactly that means in a moment. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why philanthropy is doing this. So one of the things, and when I say this, I mean supporting media and journalism. One of the things that I think about a lot in my role at MIF is, how do information ecosystems in communities play a role in solving problems? Because there are a lot of problems and there are a lot of bad actors that are fueling a system of disinformation. And that disinformation is fueling confusion and doubt and mistrust in communities all across America. And disinformation has literally become a matter of life and death, as we've seen, particularly for marginalized communities. And you don't really need to look much further than COVID to see that. Should I take the vaccine? Can I trust it? Should I drink bleach to kill the virus? Should I attend this COVID party down the street so we can all get it at once? Or one question that millions of Americans have been asking and continue to ask: was the 2020 presidential election fraudulent? So it's been frightening at times to see what information others are perceiving as real. And supporting good quality information is one effective antidote to this growing crisis, because it reconnects communities and it re-engages us in issues that matter to all of our lives, our shared civic life. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to provide an overview of the media philanthropy landscape and why philanthropy and why some of you on this call may be ready to increase support for media and journalism. Thank you, Adriana. So I mentioned that my organization represents funders who support media and journalism in the public interest. So let's unpack that. Who are these funders? These are funders who may be funding media and journalism directly, like the Knight Foundation. But what is far more common is that funders are typically supporting media through their program areas, whether it's health or climate change or gun violence or education. The list is long. And funders are supporting media through all of those portfolios because they see media as a tool to advance their programmatic priorities. And I'm sure that this is something Karen and Kristen can speak to later in this program. And when we talk about the media in media philanthropy, there has been a huge shift in our collective thinking and understanding around the definition. So today, media is much, much more than journalism and newspapers, and philanthropic support for media can be through documentary films, it can be through research, it can be through VR, and of course, it can be through public media, which philanthropy has been supporting for a long, long time. But it can also mean access to and flow of information. It can be text messages delivering important information about housing and utilities, as is the case with an innovative organization up in Detroit. It can be electronic billboards during times of natural disasters, which the Dodge Foundation in New Jersey supported when Hurricane Sandy struck. So ultimately, there are a lot of creative ways to fund media and journalism and storytelling in your community, but it starts with understanding what your community wants and needs, because there's no one approach that will work for everyone. And understanding what's needed in your community requires a little bit of context about what the news landscape looks like and sort of how we got here. So what we're talking about today are essentially these concepts that you see on the screen. Journalism is in crisis, and that crisis has had very serious consequences for our democracy. But philanthropy has stepped up in a lot of different ways to address these challenges, way too many to name on this hour-long call. Next slide, Adriana. Thank you. Thank you. So let's talk about the first one. Journalism is in crisis. I think we know this part. Across the country, newsrooms are shrinking, they're closing down. There have been severe economic and technological challenges that really have crippled our industry. Our friends at the Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy, if you've heard of this center, they do a lot of media research. They conducted a comprehensive survey of philanthropic support for the news a couple years ago and provided us with this interesting context that I like to share, because I think it really puts what's happening in the news industry into perspective. So jobs in the US steel industry declined 64% over 35 years. Jobs at US newspapers declined 58% over just 15 years. That 10-year period between 2008 and 2018 lost 36,000 newspaper journalists, and I count myself among them. So next slide, Adriana. Communities all across the United States are dealing with a severe decline, and in many cases, a complete elimination of local news. And this is what we would call a news desert, which really refers to any community that has diminished access to important information that promotes civic engagement. So this map that you're looking at, it's called a news desert map. Penelope Muse Abernathy, she's the Knight Chair in Journalism and Digital Media Economics at UNC. She studies news deserts and recently released the latest data on news deserts in the US. So I'm about to give you a lot of information, but I'll try to drill it down. So today in this country, more than 200 of America's 3,143 counties have no local newspaper. Half of those counties have only one newspaper, and 2/3 of those counties, that's 2,000 counties in this country, no longer have a daily newspaper. So what exactly does that mean in terms of people? It means 70 million Americans are living in a community without a newspaper, or are living in a community that's at risk of losing their newspaper. So because we're talking about New England in this conference, we can take a minute to look at the news desert situation in New England. I would venture to say that some of you listening to this call right now may be living in a news desert. I won't go through each state, but we can look at a couple. So Maine has 1 county without a newspaper and 4 counties with just 1 newspaper. The number of newspapers dropped 10% between 2004 and 2019. But listen to this, statewide, in that same time period, newspaper circulation dropped almost 40%. So think about how many people, because of that circulation drop, aren't reading daily news. Now, there are other organizations that are attempting to fill the gap. There are 2 online news organizations that cover Maine, as well as 3 public broadcasting stations. But there are 0 ethnic media outlets in all of Maine, which I understand is predominantly white. But the Hispanic Latino population is the fastest growing population in Maine right now. Now let's move over to New Hampshire. New Hampshire is doing a little bit better. There are no counties in New Hampshire without a newspaper. Most have 1. Statewide, there was a 9% decrease in newspapers and just a 7% decrease in circulation. But same sort of pattern here. There are 0 ethnic media outlets in New Hampshire, where the fastest growing population is the Hispanic Latino population. And I also want to note that a lot of the counties that have 1 single newspaper, many of those newspapers are weeklies. And so many communities are still going without daily news and information. There's a lot to unpack with this map. If you'd like to look deeper, you can go to usnewsdeserts.com, and I can drop the link into the chat when I'm done with this presentation, and you can check out the interactive map there. Adriana, next slide, please. So adding to those challenges is the fact that consumers' habits have changed a lot. People in my generation and younger primarily are reading news online on their computers, or more and more on mobile. And more than that, people are shifting toward news shared by friends and peers rather than directly from original content producers. And I think we know that that is not a good thing. Pew has done a lot of research about this point in particular, and has found that about half of Americans are getting some of their daily news from social media. Not a surprise. A third of Americans regularly get their news from Facebook, probably also not a surprise, but I think you know where this is going. This is really where we start to get into issues with misinformation and disinformation. Adding to all that, as if we didn't need any more challenges, is that the press is really under attack in some unprecedented ways. When the press is referred to as the enemy of the people, or when public officials label news they don't like as fake news, or when reporters are murdered for reporting stories that people don't like, that sounds like something that happens in faraway parts of the world in undemocratic countries, but it's happening here, as was the case in Las Vegas a few months ago. All of this contributes to the growing doubt and mistrust in the public square. And so I think that Joy Mayer may have presented from Trusting News. She may have presented on a panel a couple of days ago as part of this conference. So I hope this isn't redundant, but I just want to point out that when we talk about trust, we have to look at whose trust we're talking about. The Poynter Institute has done some pretty interesting research around trust in the news. Early on in the Trump administration, they found that 1 year in, Democrats trusted the media more and Republicans trusted it less. A large majority of Trump supporters agreed with Trump's description that the press was the enemy of the people, and agreed that the government should be able to block access to news stories. Now, I'm not saying this because I'm trying to take sides. I'm saying, what does this show? It shows that rhetoric used against the press has really sunk in. This same research found that 44% of people believed that the press was making up stories. 44%. That means that nearly half of America thought that the press was making things up. So again, I just want to be clear about what I'm saying here. Trust should not be partisan. These findings should be troubling to everybody, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. We really need to be able to agree on the same set of facts. Next slide, Adriana. So what do all these challenges facing journalism mean for our democracy? Well, it's pretty simple. When news organizations close or when they struggle to address the concerns of their communities, basically when there aren't enough reporters in the places that they need to be, like school board meetings or zoning meetings or state houses, where laws about reproductive health are being made, issues that are super critical to people's lives, they all receive less independent scrutiny from journalists, and people just have less access to the information they need to engage. And this is really where we get into case making. When funders approach their board with proposals to fund media and journalism in their communities, it's very often around these dynamics, that when the journalism falters, it undermines absolutely everything else the foundation is trying to do. Adding to all of that, if that weren't enough, disinformation is getting better. It's doing a better job of masquerading as real news, and it has absolutely exploded all across the information ecosystem. It's undermining public trust in reliable journalism, and it's exploiting the information vacuum left by shrinking news operations, and it is just majorly disrupting the way we interact with one another, with our government, with our media. Next slide, Adriana. Thank you. So at this point in the presentation, this is when people start to feel kind of down, kind of depressed. Nina, why are you telling us all of these awful things? But this is not supposed to be a doom and gloom presentation, because we're just getting to the part where I say philanthropy has been such a bright spot in supporting news and information, rebuilding news and information, and reimagining news and information so that the news reaches communities that have historically been ignored by traditional media. Philanthropy is supporting storytelling that is making a huge impact on our communities. And there's one of my favorite stories that I want to share, is that the reporter who broke the Flint water crisis story, he was a reporter who was funded by philanthropy. His name is Kurt Guyette. He was a reporter who was hired by the ACLU of Michigan, which has never had a reporter there. And that position was funded by the Ford Foundation. And he's the guy who broke the story and made it, a national story for months and years and forced change in Flint, Michigan. And you do not need to be the Ford Foundation to make an impact like that. Next slide, Adriana. So how do we know philanthropy is stepping up to support news and information? So one of the ways that MIF serves this field is that we track the flow of philanthropic dollars with our media grants data map, which was developed for us by Candid, formerly the Foundation Center. So with this map, which shows the scope of philanthropically funded media since 2009, we've produced many important reports looking at trends in journalism, looking at funding and where it is and who it's going to. We've produced a couple reports focusing on community foundation support for journalism, environmental media, and many more. Next slide, Adriana. So I won't spend too much time going over this map. This could take another couple hours to really dig into this data, but I do want to share some top line data just to give you a sense of scope of how big this field really is. So we can go from national to local, because I did pull some numbers for New England. So nationally, US foundations have invested more than $24 billion in media since 2009. Look at these two numbers on the right-hand side here. It has nearly tripled in the last decade. So funders are paying attention. Next slide, Adriana. When we look specifically at journalism, the number drops significantly to 3.2 billion, but still a really large number, just a relatively small piece of the total media funding pie. And journalism funding in the US, again, has nearly quadrupled in the last decade, if you look at those two numbers on the right-hand side. And just a quick side note, if anyone has questions about how media grants are coded or how we came up with this map, I'm happy to explain and show you everything, offline. It's just a lot to get into this discussion. When we drill down to New England, we see a very similar pattern. Support for journalism is a fairly small piece of the total funding pie, but look at that increase in funding from 2009 to 2019. That's more than a 10x increase in funding in a decade. Next slide, Adriana. So the next two slides show us the top 10 recipients of journalism funding in New England. And then the slide after that is the top 10 funders of journalism in New England. Now, this may be a little small, maybe you can't read this, but on this slide for top 10 recipients, I'm showing you this for a couple reasons. One, to show that most of the top 10 recipients are located in a big city in Massachusetts, and also to point out the difference between the top funder at 17 million and the 10th funder at 3.6 million. Next slide, Adriana. Top 10 funders. Why am I showing you this? So this is interesting because I want to point out a couple things. I want to point out some of philanthropy's blind spots. It's really important to note that at the state and local level, most nonprofit media funding comes from large national foundations, and you can see that playing out in this list. So most funding at the state and local level does not come from community foundations or public charities or donor advised funds. The other thing that I want to point out is that there tends to be a concentration of foundation investments within a relatively few nonprofits. And there's certainly a case to be made for more funding of nonprofit media outlets outside of the Northeast
I can do it.
and the West Coast, where most major foundations are based. And I think I'm bringing this up because we won't be able to address the equity piece if many states still don't have access to quality news. So why am I showing you these lists? Because I believe that philanthropy must be transparent about some of its criticisms. And two, because look at the incredible opportunity there is to step in and support information in your community. Most of these funders on this list are outside of New England. Next slide, Adriana. So I won't bombard you with any more data. I will close with just a couple resources to give you some more information on media and journalism grant making. One of them is called Journalism and Media Grant Making, 5 Things You Need to Know and 5 Ways to Get Started. It's really a starter guide for foundations who sort of want the information they need drilled down in an easy to read form. It's a primer on where to start. It was produced by MIF back in 2018. Obviously, a lot has happened since then, but it's still a solid resource. Another one is the American Press Institute's ethics guidelines on philanthropically funded news. There's a set of guidelines for funders and a set for newsrooms, and it's widely considered the standard for nonprofit newsrooms. And I suspect we will get into a deeper discussion on ethics and editorial independence. There's also one funding model that I want to share because it's a pretty easy, low lift on-ramp, and it's called Newsmatch. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you may have participated in it. It's a matching gift campaign that raises money for nonprofit newsrooms across the country. And it's engaged tens of thousands of new donors to nonprofit journalism, including place-based and community foundations. So I think that that's something worth looking into. And of course, like I said before, there are many funding models. There's no one size fits all approach to supporting journalism. And then last, but hopefully not least, there's media impact funders. We are a very vibrant network of funders of all different sizes, all different grant making priorities. And members of our Journalism Funders Network meet monthly to talk about their strategies, ask questions, and generally just stay connected with what's happening in the field. And more importantly, they come to stay connected to one another. So if you're interested in joining these monthly meetings, or perhaps you can make it to our annual Journalism Funders Gathering in October in New York City, you can email me, and Adriana, if you could put the last slide up, my contact information is up there. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Should I pass it to you, Steve, my mentor?
Yes, thank you, Nina. Yeah, we worked together about a short time ago. It was 20 some odd years ago. So
And
thank
you
you
taught me
very
a lot. You taught me a lot.
well. I think
Thank
you're
you.
teaching us a lot now, and that's what matters. So thank you very much for all of this, and we're gonna hear more later on. So I'm Steve Leone, I'm publisher at the Concord Monitor in Concord, New Hampshire. So now we're gonna talk about 4 community-funded projects in New Hampshire. So this will give you a sense of what partnerships can look like and the impacts they can have on communities. So I'm going to kick this over to Melanie Plenda from the Granite State News Collaborative.
Thank you so much, Steve. Yes, I'm Melanie Plenda from the Granite State News Collaborative. The Granite State News Collaborative is a partnership of more than 20 trusted local news, educational, and community organizations who've agreed to work together to get more news and more information to more people across the state of New Hampshire. As journalists, our job is to serve our communities by keeping them informed on issues and events so they can make decisions, affect change, build the communities they want to see. And even when newsrooms lose reporters, editors, resources, that need and that obligation does not go away. We still have to provide that service. So we all agreed to work together to make sure that that happens. Essentially, the collaborative exists to fill gaps, and we do this in several ways. So first, we manage a news exchange where partners share content with each other that can then be cross-published across any platform. Second, we help our partners coordinate coverage of major events and issues with each other and then help manage those efforts. And third, we have a team of investigative freelancers and a data editor who works directly with our partner editors to produce time and resource intensive stories and projects that need lots of research, lots of data and investigation. And finally, we try to help diversify and restock newsrooms by training new and emerging and non-traditional journalists. And that often means working with community members as well. So all of our services are free to member outlets, and all members contribute in-kind time and resources. And we are entirely community funded. With that support, we've been able to launch ambitious solutions-focused investigative series on exclusionary zoning practices at the root of the affordable housing crisis, proposed police reforms, the divisive concepts law, the treatment of Indigenous people in New Hampshire, equity in New Hampshire education, and environmental justice, and that's just to name a few. We've also been able to facilitate efforts to increase education around and access to civic engagement. We've covered the pandemic together. We've covered 2 elections together, including the 2022 midterms, where with community members and media partners, we were also able to provide midterm election coverage and candidate information in Spanish. And neither the coverage of the elections nor Spanish media or Spanish language coverage had ever happened in New Hampshire before. So we were pretty proud of being able to work together to make that happen. We've also launched a weekly digital public affairs series and 3 podcasts, all in a way to reach even more people and different audiences, to provide that information to people, as Nia said, who maybe haven't had access to that information before. We also recently launched a pilot project with the Nacky Loeb School to train local community members and college students to cover local municipal meetings. Now, these meetings may be a mundane part of civic life, but what happens during them impacts every single person living and working in a community. And local news reporting resources are often stretched so thin. And our project aims to address this gap, as well as educate the public and how they can access their local government and be more engaged. And our work is having a real and actual community impact. For example, Our reporting on exclusionary zoning prompted city officials in Manchester, New Hampshire to reach out to our data reporter for input on future zoning policy decisions. Our environmental justice work led to local advocates circulating petitions to address lead poisoning, and municipal and policy officials from across the state and country regularly download the public data and maps we've gathered and created that didn't exist publicly in that form before. And our work on the treatment of Indigenous communities in New Hampshire actually was able to shake loose a logjam that had prevented the Commission on Native American Affairs from officially doing their work. So with the goal of more news to more communities in mind, we've really successfully been able to use that community support we've received to pay our freelancers to provide more than 600 time and resource intensive pieces of journalism to our partners. And we estimate that one story shared through our partner network has the potential to reach as many as 3 million people through print, newsletters, online platforms, and broadcasts in New Hampshire, parts of Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine. And our partners have cross-published more than 6,000 partner shared stories. And that breaks down to each outlet having 23 additional impactful stories per week from vetted local sources for their communities. And that's tantamount to each outlet essentially adding 2 staff reporters. As community leaders, we have a responsibility to help address the local news crisis that's leaving too many people in the dark about the issues affecting their daily lives. And so we're taking action by looking toward the future and working on ways to sustain journalism, not only now, but in the state of New Hampshire well into the future. And so one of our initiatives going forward is creating a community news fund with the belief that a rising tide lifts all boats. We're in this for the long haul and for the betterment of our community, and we're in it together. And I thank you for your time. And now I'll pass it on to Gabriela Lozada.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabi Lozada, and I am the Latinx community reporter at NHPR, New Hampshire Public Radio. I work for the KI de Nuevo New Hampshire newscast, which translates to What's Up New Hampshire. It is the NHPR initiative that engages Spanish-speaking communities by offering relevant daily news and original content. We use WhatsApp as a popular messaging app among Latinos as our platform. We also publish and translate our content to English for the regular NHPR radio programming and website. KI, as our listeners call it dearly, started during the pandemic as a resource for the Latino community to get verified news and stop misinformation, but it has grown so much since then. Now we are a 3 women's team of bilingual journalists. We translate daily news, but we also produce original features and spots and long-form interviews covering topics such as politics, environment, health, education, immigration, and culture, all tailored to the Latino community, always keeping in mind that we have so much diversity inside it because we come from so many countries. We even include content for the Brazilian community that understands Spanish. Additionally, we have a video series called Visibles that we broadcast every 2 months. In it, Latinos from all sorts of lives shared stories of their moment that defined their lives. Like, for example, when they decided to leave their country, to adopt a child, or when they lost a loved one. Our premise is that every story matters. We have 6 seasons already, and we have been receiving great feedback and people wanting to tell their own journeys. We also partnered recently with the Granite State the Granite State News Collaborative to do a regional Visibles season with Latinos who live in Vermont, Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire, and that will hopefully launch in the fall. We are providing quality independent journalism. Our mission is to build relationships with an audience that might have trust to tell their stories, because after all, in most cases, when a reporter approaches them, those stories end up being published in a language that is not theirs. And we are trying to change that with content that is not only about Latinos, but it's for Latinos. In our 3 years broadcasting the newscast, we have learned that people view us as a powerful source of information. And I am not only talking about news. In New Hampshire, there isn't an official Latino center where the community can find a place to meet or get information about resources. And people constantly ask us things like how they can access affordable housing, how to receive information in Spanish about their school district, or simply how to meet other Latinos. We try to connect them with people who can help them. We always tell our audience that we are just a message away from them. We can deliver our content thanks to the NHPR donor support. Since the project started during the pandemic, NHPR has raised $428,000 in commitments from 11 individual donors and grantors. KI also receives a grant from Report of America that allows the newsroom to have me on their team. And we also have sponsors, among them the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and New Hampshire Legal Aid. Our audience has doubled in the past 2 years since we started doing original content. We have almost 500 subscribers, and I think this growth indicates that people like to hear themselves on the radio, or in our case, on WhatsApp. Recently, one of our listeners, a father of 2 who immigrated to New Hampshire from El Salvador, told me that he hopes to hear the voices of undocumented people who can't obtain driver's licenses in New Hampshire. He lives with the fear of being detained every day and hopes the legislation changes one day. And those are the voices that we want to amplify. We also reported recently about an asphalt plant project that can deeply affect the lives of Black and Latino communities. And when we approach that community, we realize the breach in information between planning boards and these communities. And there are so many other ways that we are connecting with our audience. Last month, we did a story about how Latino seniors in New Hampshire are left behind in accessing resources because of lack of state outreach in Spanish. Many listeners wrote us and called us telling about their personal experiences with their loved ones. One of them wants to unite several organizations to end the information disparity. And personally, I was touched by the trust they have in us to tell those stories. And we also learned that we have listeners in Texas also that are going through the same issues. We have been consulted by different newsrooms in other states where they want to do similar initiatives. But we not only report about the necessities and issues of the community, we also celebrate the businesses, the culture, the connections, and the pride of being Latinos. We would like to expand our presence in the future. We have been considering incorporating citizen journalism for people interested in reporting about their own communities. And finally, Care de Nuevo New Hampshire has opened my eyes to my own community, and hopefully we are doing the job to help others see inside it too. And I'm gonna put in the chat the QR code for those who want to subscribe to the newscast. Thank you so much.
Now we'll turn it over to Olivia Belanger.
Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Belanger. I am the Health Solutions Reporter for the Keene Sentinel's Monadnock Region Health Reporting Lab. The lab is the Sentinel's first ever donor-funded model, and that launched in February of 2022. All of our content is free outside of the Sentinel's paywall, and that includes print stories, email newsletter, and a podcast. And all of our stories are aimed at having a solutions journalism lens, which I'll get into the reasoning in just a second. So this idea came from, as a legacy news organization, you know, the Sentinel is always trying to find different ways to stay relevant and to retain our current audience while also attracting new ones. And so our president had come up with this idea for a reporting lab. The health beat made sense for it for a variety of reasons. One of them being that I am the most senior reporter at the Sentinel, so it was an easy transition for me to go over there with the beat that I was already covering. Also, we were very much still in the height of COVID as we were developing this idea, and all of our COVID content was already free outside of our paywall, so it was easy for us to transition the rest of our health content outside of it. Beyond that, we also know that health affects everybody, and if we really wanted to expand our reach as widely as possible, we knew that we wanted to do it with something that could really resonate with everybody. And we named it a lab with intention. You know, we really wanted this to be a laboratory where we could come up with our weirdest ideas, our craziest ideas, and just throw everything at the wall and see what stuck without a lot of rules or regulation. And before we officially launched, we wanted to start by listening. So we went and met with more than 30 people between health experts, patients, community members, anyone who we felt could really talk about the current health landscape in our area, and talk to them about what coverage did they need, what did they want, what were we already missing. And we found two really big points from those two conversations. One of them was that people really wanted a deeper dive into health issues. They didn't just want that daily turnaround story that they kept seeing. And then also they really wanted solutions. You know, most of our subscribers have lived in rural areas their whole life, and they're not surprised by the fact that the rural health landscape is bleak and that there are a lot of issues within it. And they didn't need to be reminded of that all the time. What they needed were solutions to fix those problems and to address their own health concerns. And so that's why we decided to bake solutions journalism right into the core of this lab. And so to fund it, we decided to do a crowdfunding campaign, which is something that we typically do anyway for the Sentinel. But this time we decided to make it specifically for the health lab. And we made that very clear through our crowdfunding campaign. And then also our president went ahead and found additional donors, whether they were people who had donated to us previously, or they were, you know, healthcare giants locally that we felt could really benefit from this coverage. In our first year, I was pulled out of the daily news rotation so that I could fully focus on this new project. And we were able to produce over 100 stories. That's between myself and with the freelancers that we have contracted through the Granite State News Collaborative. That's been a huge piece of this. We wanted to make sure that we had enough money in our budget every year to make it so that we could contract out freelance stories regularly. One, because I'm only one person and I can only do so much coverage, but also we really wanted to diversify the voices that were producing these health stories. You know, I only have one viewpoint, right? And so we wanted to make sure that we were hitting things from all the different angles and giving people as much health content as possible. Beyond the normal print stories, I also started a health newsletter called The Checkup that focuses on local health issues, from, you know, my own experiences with mental health or physical health issues to, you know, here's where you can get a flu shot locally, to here's this cool local initiative that maybe it doesn't need a whole new story, but I think that people could still resonate with it. I also launched in February a 4-episode podcast called Invisible Illness, where each episode I speak with a different local person about their experience with a disease that is not outwardly visible. And that space is really just to give them the space to tell their own story for once and not have it, you know, chopped up into different bits by reporters, and just give them that time to really explain what this is like for them. And outside of news content, we've also done a lot of cool things, including a couple of weeks ago, we put on our first free health fair. So that was like a career fair for local health resources. And that included, you know, workshops, live demonstrations, as well as just information about what was available to you locally. And we also produced a family resource guide, which we distributed to a variety of nonprofits and other places in the area. That included, you know, housing supports, to how to enroll into preschool, to how to get a PCP. And then moving forward, our hope is to do this for 3 years. And then so by 2025, we'll have enough information to prove that this concept works. We've already produced our first impact report, which came out earlier this year. And we're constantly collecting data on how our work is making an impact. And the hope is to expand this model into other parts of our newsroom. Immediately, our plan is to create a multimedia studio and hire a second visual journalist to head that, so that we can really bake in multimedia more into our health lab content to, again, hopefully reach larger audiences. So thank you so much for your time. I'm going to drop in all of the information on the health lab, as well as my contact information. So if anybody has questions beyond this conversation, I'm happy to answer those. But thank you so much for your time.
All right. Bring them up. Again, Steve Leone, publisher of the Concord Monitor in Concord, New Hampshire. So I think I'd like to start with this is kind of how we transformed the Monitor newsroom into really aligned with philanthropic need. And it really started with the map that Nina showed earlier today, the news desert map, which shows a whole lot of places that don't have news. And why that's important is because once you read about news deserts, you start to realize what happens when there is no local news source. You know, from your civic engagement goes down, voting goes down, your public spending goes up. You know, really you become a less healthy community in many different ways. So the unfortunate reality is that it doesn't become evident the role of news plays in a healthy community until it's gone. So we really set out to say, you know what, we can't wait that long. We need to start moving now. So we really set out, and this is before the pandemic, to transform, you know, the way we looked at things. We were fortunate enough to get 2 Report for America positions. It was that spring. So remember March, pandemic hit. By June, we had a health reporter and education reporter. Like literally the 2 most important positions you could have in a pandemic. They came over the hill and really gave us information that there's no way we would have been able to report the way we reported during the pandemic without them. So that's where we realized that, look, this stuff really does make a difference. And it does allow you to deliver content to your readers in a way that you wouldn't be able to do without these partnerships. So, you know, it's not limited to that. I mean, we've had 3 Report for America positions in that time, but we've also focused on building partnerships. Our partnership with the Granite State News Collaborative is something that we're really proud of, as is every other member of the collaborative in the state. It's just really been a transformative group of newsrooms pulling together for all the right reasons. So that's been great. We've also worked with Local Media Foundation nationally, Pointer, Trusting News, Solutions Journalism, and a lot of organizations in New Hampshire. We've hired an engagement editor because that role really helps us pull all of these pieces together. So kind of made a list here of all, you know, we've had the 3 Report for America positions, but we've also been able to incorporate fundraising into a lot of other positions. So we have fundraising aligned to our health reporting, or in the past, health reporting, education, politics, the environment, the housing crisis, science, disparity in our state, many other topics. And this has, again, helped us do our job. What do? We listen, we find where the need is, and we respond with journalism to help address some of these issues. So that's been great, but we also realize that, you know, us doing our job isn't quite enough. We need to do a little bit better of a job of actually explaining what it is we do. So 2 years ago, we set out to create an impact report. And usually when I come to these things, I like to lead with something that I can steal, quite literally, in terms of an idea. And this was something that I stole from a different newsroom. I think it was from Detroit, and had them say, hey, this impact report, what does that look like? They sent it to me, and then we kind of made our own spin on it. We've done 2 impact reports now. And I can drop in the chat after this what our version of an impact report looks like. But it's really what it is you're reporting to the community what you've done, how these partnerships have actually led to stories that are aligned with the things that most people feel make for a better community. So with our impact report, we actually put it in the newspaper. We printed it. It was a 16-page report, told people who we were, what we were doing, why we were doing it. It showcased some of our best stories of the year from, we did an explorational link between mental health and police shootings and the challenges facing local schools. Our 2 New Hampshire's beat, which is really, it's a Report from America beat built out of disparity in our state. And then a lot of other examples of, you know, how to submit your opinion into our opinion pages and how we come to the decisions we come to. We've included things like the terms of agreements that we actually have our funders sign and say, all right, this is what a community partnership is. This is what it's not. This is how it functions. We've been able to, independent of the impact report, we've included that on a weekly basis in print. And we have a standing vertical on our site that lists all of our funders. Again, the terms of agreement that they generally sign on to understand, where this line is, because that's something that we take seriously. It's something, honestly, that they take seriously too. I don't think most funders want to be in the business of anything other than saying, yes, we need more journalism. Go do your job and go do it with integrity. So, I think the impact report has been something that has allowed us to, at the end of the year, take account and say, this is what we've been able to do, communicate that to our community, but also take stock ourselves on what we've been able to accomplish, reorient ourselves. And in the impact report, we tell people where we're going. And I think we're more clear with ourselves on where we're going and what we're trying to accomplish from having done the report a couple of years. So I'll drop that into the chat. If you're interested in looking, you can certainly reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. But otherwise, handing it back to you, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Steve, and everyone. And now we will we will bring back Nina, and joining her will be two New Hampshire-based funders whose area of support include local journalism. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, Laura Simoes, director of the Naki S. Loeb School of Communications in Manchester, New Hampshire, and she will be moderating our Q&A panel.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much for your remarks at the start of the session. I'd say by way of further introduction, Karen and then Kristen, could you each please tell us about your organizations and how you started the work that you're doing in this space? So Karen, how did your organization get started in news philanthropy?
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm Karen Ager, Director of Communications for the New Hampshire Endowment for Health. We're the state's largest health foundation. And other than doing some operating support to the New Hampshire Public Radio and the Blue Cross Blue Shield Health Coverage Fellowship, we were pretty much that limited in terms of our support to journalism. But about 10 years ago, a new strategic plan was approved. We had new priority areas coming online, and the recognition from our board that we needed to do more than just create internal communication vehicles in order to raise awareness. And so we got the green light to go forth and forge underwritten media partnerships, at which point I begged for more time to research it, to find out what is the best way to approach that. We really wanted to go beyond traditional problems-based reporting. And so through talking to national foundations and finally hearing from the Solutions Journalism Network at a national conference, we began bringing in the practice of solutions journalism, first through convening about 60 reporters and editors in the state to learn more about it. And then subsequently kind of looking for which news outlets had readiness to take on some of our new issues. One was healthy aging. We partnered for 2 years with the New Hampshire Union Leader for 2 years of solutions-based coverage. That happened in 2016. And then in 2019, we forged another partnership, which ended up to be 2 years of underwritten coverage with the Laconia Daily Sun on the topic of civic and civil engagement and a variety of social determinants of health. So both of those coverage initiatives were very successful. And that's how we got into it, kind of slowly but surely, trying to gauge readiness, trying to educate everyone about what it was. When we were first getting into it, I think there was less awareness of it, and it was not as common to be partnering with foundations from media outlet standpoint.
Thank you. Kristen, could you answer the same question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Oliveri from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. So the Charitable Foundation, as a community foundation, we represent hundreds of generous Granite staters who are interested in lots of different issues. So we fund a broad range of issues like education, environment, health and well-being. But we also realize the importance of investing in journalism to have a strong media landscape to advance all of those issues. So it was really, I think, similar to Karen about 10 years ago. So again, we had always supported nonprofit media outlets like NHPR and NHPBS. But about 10 years ago, our Neil and Louise Tillotson Fund that covers the North Country of New Hampshire, they started to invest in media to expand coverage in the North Country. And then similar to Karen, and with a lot of help and support from Karen showing the way, we started to focus on solutions journalism reporting around the opioid crisis. And we did projects with NHPR and the Union Leader. And since then, we have funded a handful of other projects. And now we're really focusing in on providing broad support to the Granite State News Collaborative and trying to, I think as Melanie was saying, to try to lift all boats and bolster the sector. So that's sort of how we got started and sort of what we're doing today.
Thank you so much. Nina, question for you. How does funding community news advance engagement in the issues that an organization, a business, or an individual might care about? How does funding journalism fit with donor priorities?
Yes, thank you for asking this, because this is a question that we get a lot, and it's one of our favorite questions. So first of all, there's a very popular saying in our space, and it's this: whatever your first issue is, media should be your second. So it's one of those things, it's like, if you know, you know. Our role is to try to convince those who do not yet know. And I understand that there are still a lot of funders who don't think journalism is something philanthropy should support. That's why it's so important to talk about the why. Why does this matter? What exactly happens when local news goes away? And I think that if we can effectively demonstrate that, then funders who are still on the sidelines will hopefully start to understand that this actually isn't about supporting journalism. It's about supporting democracy and community. And there are so many reasons, bipartisan, research-backed reasons, not reasons that I'm just coming to you with, with anecdotal evidence. There are reasons that show how journalism makes sense for donor priorities. We know that when journalism suffers in a community, your government becomes less efficient. Your taxes might go up. Your officials may not return your phone calls as much. Maybe crimes aren't cleared at a higher rate than they would if there were reporters in places they need to be. Certainly, civic engagement drops, voter turnout drops. And so I think funders are really starting to see that when local media leaves, it's not just journalism as a broken business model. It's that our sense of place, our social fabric starts to deteriorate. And so, like, if your job as a funder is to tell your community story, how on earth do you do that if you're not supporting the healthy flow of information?
Thank you so much. And, following up on that, Karen, as grant makers at the Endowment for Health, how does funding community news advance engagements in the issues that your organization cares about and is funding in other places?
Yeah, well, when we started the first coverage series called Silver Linings with the Union Leader, we spent a lot of time with our board on, the inside of the endowment, making sure every board member understood editorial independence, understood there's no way a media outlet will agree to work with us if we don't respect that. And, just making sure they would have our back, because maybe we weren't going to agree with every headline, and that would have to be okay, because, we trusted the news outlet to do good coverage. But we also recognized that all of the advocates in the healthy aging space were really stood to learn things, because practice of solutions journalism looks for what they call the positive deviant. Where else in the country are they getting better outcomes on these issues? And is there some type of approach or several approaches that we could report on that might be worth considering? It's certainly not the news outlet saying this approach is good and you should use it, but it's examining it, it's investigating it. And so it was a really good learning opportunity for the whole field of healthy aging. And we also found that with the Laconia Daily Sun's coverage, they did everything from the existence of bias, hate, and intolerance in the region, to local downtown economic viability, to mental health issues in schools. It was very far-reaching. And so it really impacted many issues we cared about, even though we went in kind of negotiating what we call the sweet spot. The news outlet has to be covering something they care about. They're not just going to say, oh, well, if the funder wants us to cover this, we'll cover it. It's a negotiation, right? And so we agreed on terms like, well, if you devote a certain percentage of your coverage to what we care about most, which is issues of hate, bias, and intolerance for that particular coverage series, then we're happy for you to do other social determinants of health and other types of civic and civil engagement that you want to cover. And we were just so blown away by the prolific amount of coverage and how it really wove through all of our priority areas in a way we wouldn't have even planned. So trust is really important when you fund with the media, and when you have a good approach like solutions journalism and a good, what I call a prenup or terms of agreement, then it's easy for the foundation to step away and just watch the magic happen.
Great. Kristen, the same question for you. How does funding community news advance the issues that the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and its donors care about in the state?
So I think, and it's really going back to what Nina said, I mean, it's making sure that there is a platform that we can get information out to folks so they can make decisions about their communities. Because as I said, we're a community foundation. We invest in lots of different areas. Our donors care about lots of different issues. So it's really about making sure that there is media there, that there is a source that people can turn to for trusted information. But I want to circle back to what Karen was talking about, and just the process that she went through, the conversations she had with the board, the conversations that she was having with the union leader and the Laconia Daily Sun to pull together these agreements. I can't tell you how helpful it was to have a partner funder that had done a lot of that work, because sometimes it can be a little overwhelming as a funder to jump into a space that you might not have experience in terms of a solutions journalism project. And Karen was so willing to share and guide us through that process. So I think to other funders that are on the call, if you're considering something similar, we would certainly be, I mean, Karen and myself would certainly be happy to talk folks through this.
Great, thank you. And Karen mentioned this already, but I just want to ask all of you maybe to say a bit about how journalism relies on trust and integrity and independence. And we know that, but that also means that funders do not in any way get to influence coverage. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a story about any situations where that might have proven to be a challenge with a donor, or how do you explain the need for editorial independence to potential donors, to your board, or to your partner organizations who might be getting ready to fund something in the community news space? And
Are you?
Nina, why don't we start with you if you'd like, and then we'll go to Karen and Kristen.
Sure. I think for the charitable foundation, it hasn't been a challenge. And I think it's not even because it's just journalism. It's how we work with our nonprofit partners. We have a conversation, we understand what they're going to be working on, but we trust our partners. They know best what they need to do and how to deliver on this work. So we make a grant. We're happy to be there as a partner through the work if they need us, but then we're excited to see what happens with the grant funds.
Nina or Karen, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I can give maybe a broader response to that. The topic specific funding approach invites questions, and that's okay. It invites questions about sort of who's calling the editorial shots, and that's okay. Questions are allowed. But I think we have gotten to the point, I hope, where it's pretty well established that journalism, especially given the economic challenges, depends on contributed revenue. Journalism has always relied on somebody else to keep the lights on, pay the bills, whether it has been from advertisers, subscriptions, membership contributions, or foundation grants. And so regardless of who's paying the bills, journalism has always had editorial and publishing firewalls to protect reporters and editors from feeling pressure from financial interests. And I guess what I would say is, there's no system that perfectly protects editorial independence. It is something that requires all people on both sides of the table to work on all the time. And I would also say, and obviously I work in philanthropy, so I'm biased toward philanthropy, but like there's no reason that we know of to think that foundation support is inherently more corrupting than any other type of support. Journalists need to operate with integrity, foundations need to operate with integrity, and there are protocols in place to make sure that that happens that I referenced earlier and that somebody posted a link to in the chat. And I would also say the more funders who are engaged in this work, I think there's less of a chance that any one donor will have an outsized influence on coverage. That's number one. And then number two, I just want to try to move this back into a positive direction. Given the crisis that we're in, it's a good thing that foundations are supporting news right now, because imagine if we had gone through this crisis and today we're having this conversation where there is no philanthropy. We would be having some very dark days.
Yeah, and just to add to that, when I was doing my research with other national foundations to try to understand how to put together an agreement and what to look for, one foundation recounted a story where they were partnering with their major news outlet on substance use issues. This foundation happened to believe that an alcohol tax was a good approach to addressing that crisis. And a headline came out in the news coverage they were funding that pointed to data saying an alcohol tax doesn't work. And their board was up in arms. And so when we talked to our board, that was a story I used to say, we really shouldn't do this unless you have our back, because it's not like an advertiser, and an advertiser shouldn't do it either. Like I advertise in your paper and I don't like the coverage. I know that doesn't get them very far, but from a media relations standpoint, I wanted to make sure no one ever tried to do that on the endowment side. And we've never had a situation where we disagreed with a headline. I would say we learned about the coverage at the time it was published because we weren't all up in the news outlet's face. But I also would say it didn't preclude us from having maybe quarterly meetings to say, how's it going? And here's what we're working on, and what are you working on? And just keeping it very friendly and mutually respectful to share ideas. Also to offer to say, there is this major convening on this topic that you're reporting on. Would you like to come? Or would it be helpful if we put together a short list of content experts around a table for you to talk to? We found that the reporters and the news outlets we worked with embraced that. So it didn't preclude us from having a good relationship. But we knew, I hope we knew how to stay out of the way and let them do their job the way they know how to do it best.
That's great. Thank you. So for everyone who's attending, we're going to move into audience questions in just a moment. I invite you to add your questions to the chat now. We'll take as many as we have time for. But while we're waiting for those audience questions to come in, this is a question for each of you. What do you think other funders can learn from your work, especially those who are not currently including any kind of news philanthropy in their giving portfolios? So be they other foundations, individuals with charitable interest, businesses, what could they learn? Maybe just one great lesson about news philanthropy. And let's start with Nina and then go to Kristen and Karen. And I'll be watching the chat for audience questions. Thank you.
So I think I mentioned this before. Funders don't need to have a dedicated media portfolio, but they also don't need to have millions of dollars to make a difference. Sometimes having an internal advocate at your foundation can be just as powerful as the money itself, especially at community foundations. And I'm sure Kristen can speak to this. Community foundations have a unique role to play. They can convene leaders in their community. And I think that there's sort of a leadership activation piece that goes along with also granting dollars.
And I think just building on what Nina said, I think it's just doing this work is just such an incredible point of leverage to advance whatever issue you care about, whatever issue that you're working on. It's a good piece of leverage to do this work.
Yeah, I would just add, when we first embarked on this work, I was very nervous approaching news outlets. I was very concerned about coming off as if our foundation expected somehow a news outlet was supposed to pander to us. And I knew that wouldn't fly, wouldn't pass the laugh test. And yet, hearing from other foundations on webinars and whatnot, or rather other news outlets, they also can sometimes feel very nervous about approaching a foundation. And so I just think that the readiness is there on both sides now, where it's very much a normal thing to do, to explore opportunities. And it is very much, as Kristen said, a win-win on both sides. If you can forge the right type of agreement and it's something, it's coverage that works for both parties, it can absolutely be a win-win, and there's no reason to hate to reach out to a foundation with an idea.
Thank you. Here's a question from the audience. The reporting required for grantees can be burdensome for newsrooms that are already very thinly staffed. Has there been any discussion about making the reporting process an easier lift for those news grantees?
I'll start off. So I think that's absolutely true. And I would say that when COVID hit, and I'm sure this is the same for a lot of other funders, we really we were trying to streamline everything that we could do to make it really easy for organizations doing the work, because they needed to focus on the work. They didn't need to focus on providing big reports to the foundation. So it's something that we're talking about. I think now for our grant makers, it's really flexible. Sometimes it might be a quick report. It might be a quick call just to talk about some of that progress. But honestly, I think a lot of what all of the news outlets were sharing in their lightning round, those are the types of things that we want to hear about. We want to know the impact of the philanthropic dollars. It doesn't necessarily have to be data burdensome. So I think just sharing those stories and anecdotes is great.
Yeah, I would add, we are working on trying to simplify reporting requirements for all grantees, whether they're journalism grantees or not. I also agree with Kristen, the proof is in your reporting, so we can see the results in a way that sometimes with other grants, it's harder to see. And all those anecdotal things matter as well, even if you can't, put a raw number on it. If the reporter got a standing ovation at a school board meeting because of their coverage on mental health in the educational system, that's something we'd like to see in your report. So they can be bullets. It doesn't have to be, a long thesis. We just, want to know the results and also what you're planning for the next phase.
Nina, do you have any examples from others around the country who have changed maybe their reporting process as a result of news philanthropy, or maybe an example of a grant reporting that you've seen that makes sense because it's easier to respond?
I haven't seen any, but I do know of a number of foundations who, again, sort of during COVID and after COVID have said, we're really going to make this as easy as possible for you. Give us your Venmo account. Well, wire you the money. I know that the Independence Public Media Foundation has done that. Many others have done that. And I can say, just from the funder side, this is an ongoing conversation for funders. But some foundations are bigger than others and they have requirements, and it's a little bit of a dance. What can we get rid of? But I also say that this is a big piece as it relates to issues of investing in equity, because there are news outlets of color who sort of don't understand all these rules and how do I get funding? And so funders really are trying to sort of get rid of a lot of these requirements and just make it simpler across the board.
Thank you. A couple more questions for you. Could any of you expand on what impact looks like with grant funding? In other words, what are you looking for when you are measuring the success of a news grant? Why don't we start with Kristen again and go to Karen and then Nina?
I think it's sort of getting back to what I said before. I think that it's really a lot of the stuff that the folks were sharing in that lightning round about just how things had shifted. It doesn't necessarily need to be that they're doing a reporting project on either aging or on the environment. We're not expecting you to solve the climate crisis. We're just looking to see that something came out of the grant. And it could be like what Karen was saying, that people were appreciating some of the reporting that was done. I think you were talking about mental health. I think the anecdotal stories are okay. It's not necessarily about how many people read the article, but what were some of the intangible, the anecdotal things that came out of the funding.
Totally agree with what Kristen is saying. I also think that, we're looking for instance, did you do a community convening at the end of year one? That would, and, in both cases, the news outlets we worked with really surprised us with innovative ways to engage the community around their coverage. That's a huge piece of it. We certainly had productivity measures, as part of the agreement. How many short form stories, how many long form stories? Again, both news outlets blew that out of the water and did many, many more than were required. So that is certainly a measure. And I know Solutions Journalism Network has something called an impact tracker, and that has several types of measures, things you can point to, maybe not a direct cause and effect, but did policy change during the time that you were reporting? Did awareness of the issue increase? Is there a way that you were able to measure that? Or some of those awards or other, letters to the editor that were written, or readers calling in or writing in, engaging with the coverage. So there's lots of ways to measure it. And in the case of the Granite State News Collaborative, our support of their excellent work, when we heard they had gotten Newsmatch grants, that definitely seems like a good result to us in terms of leverage funding and making their work sustainable. And so, that just, I think, cemented more confidence in our ongoing support for their work as well. So results take a lot of different forms, I think, in a funder's mind.
And it
Nina?
also takes a lot of time. Social change takes so much time. And I would also add to that, not that, see, it's tricky, right? Because journalists and newsrooms aren't naturally looking for social change, but if we're reporting on a topic for 10 years, we would think that topic would improve in some way, that the issues around that topic would improve in some way. And so tracking social issues takes a lot of time. And I don't think measuring impact is something that comes naturally to journalists, because many of them still feel that, we're neutral observers, we're just reporting on what's happening. But I think funders are exactly what Karen said. There are funders who are sort of moving toward an engaged journalism model. How many people talked about the story instead of just clicked? Who in the community is discussing this issue, I think, is far more useful than some of the sort of outdated metrics.
Thank you so much. Social change takes time. There is something to put on a bumper sticker for sure. I wanted to try to fit in 2 more questions before we end at 2:30. And I think that this one is really meant for our local funders in New Hampshire, are those who are doing direct grant making, which is, are there any newspaper organizations too small to be considered for grant funding?
I think from the endowment's perspective, because we've been more on the side of issue-based coverage versus support journalism because we want strong journalism. I mean, we are moving toward that, but that's not where we started. I think it's not necessarily about the size of the news outlet. It's about what we're trying to accomplish. What issue needs like a statewide reach versus is there something going on in a region we'd like to address? And so that would certainly direct us toward a specific newspaper that serves that region. And so smaller isn't necessarily detrimental. I've talked to other funders around New England who are grappling with what their local newspaper reports on. So if they're not doing hard news coverage, that might be a question. Then do you absolutely need to stay local, or do the people in your community or catchment area read other newspapers who might be doing, harder news coverage? But it just really depends on the issue and what you're trying to accomplish, because your strategy in working with a news outlet could be totally different depending.
Kristen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I think just going back to a point that Nina had raised in the very beginning when she was talking about the landscape of media in the state and how we don't have outlets representing different ethnicities. And it might be that there is a startup outlet that is very small and doesn't have a huge following, but that's something that the charitable foundation, as we're working to advance equity and racial justice, that we would consider funding that.
Thank you. We have one last question here we're going to squeeze in the time that we have left. And that is, And let's start with Nina on this one with sort of a national perspective, and then we'll move to our more local funders. But is there a difference in how news philanthropy and the foundations or organizations funding that treat profitable, like for-profit versus nonprofit news outlets when they're making contributions?
Yeah, that's a question that we've been getting more and more, especially because the majority of the Black press, for example, they're for-profit newsrooms, and they sort of feel like they've been locked out of philanthropic dollars. So there's definitely been a shift in philanthropy to try to understand, how do we give money to for-profit newsrooms? And I think like one easy answer is, well, you have to do it through a fiscal sponsor. And I'm sure Karen and Kristen can speak with way more authority than I can. That's like, there are a lot of different models for that happening all around the country. Like, the Tampa Bay Times is a for-profit newspaper owned by a nonprofit institution, the Poynter Institute. The daily papers of record in many big cities are sort of launching these philanthropic arms in order to receive philanthropic dollars. It's a question that we're sort of still working through, though, because it's complicated. But I'm sure Karen and Kristen have way more expertise on this.
Well, I mean, just from experience of how, for instance, our board, we did have questions before we embarked on these, our board saying, why would we give a grant to a for-profit news organization? Isn't that what they do? And really, I wish I had had Nina's presentation, but I did try to speak to, the growing financial strain on newsrooms, and that the kind of deep coverage we were looking for simply couldn't happen without support. And that was enough to address that question, and we moved on and were able to make the grants. And absolutely, fiscal sponsorship. Sometimes news outlets are trying to figure out, do we have to start our own nonprofit in order to be able to receive this money? That's not what news organizations do, unless you're a larger one and you can start up a whole department. And I know some have, but the smaller ones, that's very difficult, and it takes them off their focus of their main wheelhouse. So I know Laura's organization has served as a fiscal sponsor and many others in our state. And that makes it much easier. I mean, we can technically make a grant to a for-profit, but it's a lot easier to give it to a nonprofit with IRS compliance. And so fiscal sponsorship is everything.
So this concludes our session today. I want to let you all know that there's contact info in the chat. If you have any questions about today's session, please feel free to reach out to me, Melanie, or Steve with questions that you might have. We've put our contact info there as well as that of other presenters. I want to thank our panelists today and everyone who participated, and special thanks to NENPA for making this content available to its members, and to all of you who are here as special guests. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and we are delighted to have been spending this time with all of you.
And to answer that last question, yes, the recording and the materials will be sent out to everyone. Thanks so much.